Hello, my name is Holland, and today I'll be presenting on weather, how it can affect our mood, and how we can counteract some of those impacts. I've been working under Dr. Mike Price in the economics department, so let's get started. So there's a huge body of research that shows that weather conditions have a significant impact on mood, and bad weather is almost universally associated with negative mood. But what if we took that a step further and actually looked at variability in weather rather than the measured weather itself? The progression of climate change is going to make weather increasingly more volatile, so learning about the impacts that volatility could have on vulnerable populations is going to be critical for targeting mediating policies to those who need them the most. So last year, I was investigating linear and nonlinear relationships between temperature variability, which we're using as our proxy for weather volatility associated with climate change, and subjective moods like worry and stress, as well as life satisfaction. So to generate my initial data set, I merged some weather data from Visual Crossing with a large global survey data set called the Gallup World Poll, which contains mood indicators like did you feel worried or stressed yesterday, as well as rich demographic data like income, employment, education, and others from respondents in over 300 global major cities. So I performed some linear regressions on this data, and I found some very small positive relationships between temperature variability and some negative moods, but these results are just averages across all demographics, so I needed to use a different approach to figure out whether the small magnitude of these relationships might be hiding significantly different impacts on different groups. So this phenomenon is actually called heterogeneity, and it happens when different groups of people see different impacts from an experimental treatment. So in the context of this research, do the effects of temperature variability on stress, for example, depend on someone's income or their geographic location or their education or another demographic variable? So to identify heterogeneity in the context of this research, I use a machine learning method called GenericML, which was first introduced in the literature in a 2020 study by Victor Chernozhukov. So after performing this analysis, I found significant heterogeneity in the relationships between temperature variance and both stress and life satisfaction. So here I'll describe the stress relationship. As you can see, the average treatment effect, which is the dot on the left, of the above median temperature variance on stress is very close to zero, but the heterogeneous treatment effect, which is the dot on the right, is positive, and that 90% confidence interval bar is well above zero. So that just means that the impact of temperature variance on stress actually varies a lot by demographic group. And what you're seeing a machine learning model to predict stress based on that data. And then finally, we'll launch an experiment where we use the model's predictions to deliver real-time mindfulness interventions to participants. So our first step is to generate those new US-based data sets with mood indicators and demographic variables similar to last year's data. So we were actually able to get another Gallup survey data set that has very similar demographic variables and exactly the same mood indicator variables as last year, which is great. Since it's US-based, we were also able to get a higher level of geographic granularity. So in the new Gallup data, we have zip code level granularity rather than major city level granularity. And we can actually merge that with NOAA weather station level data. So we have more granularity, which is going to allow for richer analysis. So after collecting this combined Gallup and weather data, from the year 2019, I found that each state had at least 6 weather stations collecting data in 2019, and some population-dense states like Texas and California had a few hundred stations. There's also significant variation in temperature variability by state. So states along the West Coast, which you see in green, tended to have lower temperature variability, while those northern states that you see in red tended to have higher temperature variability. So the next step in this process is to train a new machine learning model to predict whether someone will self-identify as stressed based on the demographic and weather variables in that US-based data set. So after training the model, we can use its predictions to determine which US locations have the highest proportion of people who are likely to be stressed as a result of high temperature variability, and then we can select those regions as the sample frame for the experiment where we'll be performing interventions. So after we determine the sample frame, we can launch the experiment with US-based participants as predicted high. And we'll ask participants to fill out daily surveys asking for demographic information and weather conditions, and then we'll feed the survey results into the machine learning model to predict whether they'll be stressed that day. And if someone is predicted to be stressed and they're in the experimental group, which will be randomly assigned, we'll offer a link to a mindfulness intervention. So in order to give participants these real-time interventions based on their predicted stress levels, we needed a two-way communication tool so that participants could fill out our surveys and we could send their responses to the model and then send interventions back to them. So we decided to do this mainly through a website with an embedded Qualtrics survey, which automatically sends responses to an AWS service to be processed, and it'll eventually be sent to the model once it's trained. And as you can see here, there's also a hidden interventions page on the website, which can only be accessed using a code that will randomize and send to participants in the experimental group if they're predicted to be stressed. So here you can see some examples of the website's interface, including the embedded survey, the home page, and that hidden interventions page. So our next steps will be developing our final set of survey questions, training the model on this new data set we've been curating throughout the semester, and getting final approval to run the experiment. So our main goal here is to quantify the impact of mindfulness interventions in areas where climate change could lead to high incidence of stress, and that'll help us better understand which groups could most benefit from government-sponsored interventions or policies in the future. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Hi, could you tell me a little bit more about the policy applications of the experiment that you're currently working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So this new experiment is really going to help us identify which intervention policies might best counteract negative impacts of weather volatility on mood, especially for the demographic groups that are most negatively impacted. So like that right here on this slide, groups that have kind of this relationship where they're especially impacted by these climate change related factors. And specifically, the government only has a finite amount of money to spend on these interventions. And so this analysis can kind of tell us if there's a policy that's most effective but also most expensive, where might that have the greatest impact? Where can we implement cheaper policies? And where might we not need interventions at all?
What type of machine learning model will you be using to predict stress?
Yeah, great question. So in last year's investigation, I used that analysis approach I kind of touched on from previous literature. That approach is actually generic in terms of the model it uses, so I tested it with multiple models to evaluate which one performed best for the data set I was using. So I found that random forest models performed the best last year. So given that this year's data is very similar, except for the fact that it's US-based, but most of the variables are the same, I'm going to start out by training random forest models on this new data.
So what are some stress-relieving interventions that have proven to be effective?
So yeah, great question. So research has actually shown that there's kind of two things that can make stress-relieving interventions more effective. They might be more effective when you perform them something called just in time. So in other words, like exactly when the person reports that they're stressed or is experiencing stress. So that's kind of why we're trying to use this methodology of having someone report stress and predict their stress and then immediately send that intervention when it's predicted. But then specific types of interventions that might be more effective, cognitive behavioral and relaxation techniques have been found in past literature to be some of the most effective intervention strategies, especially in the workforce. And mindfulness can also be a really helpful technique, which is why we're planning to focus on that.